The night was thick with silence, interrupted only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chirping of unseen crickets. A storm had passed earlier, leaving the road slick and gleaming under the dim glow of streetlights. The air smelled of damp earth, mixed with the faint tang of gasoline from passing cars. It was a road like any other, a stretch of asphalt leading to nowhere in particular. But tonight, it would become the stage for an act of cruelty so heartless, so brutal, that it would shake the very foundation of what it meant to be human. A lone car barreled down the empty highway, its tires splashing through shallow puddles. Inside, two figures sat in the front seats. The driver's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The passenger, a man with a hardened face and cold eyes, reached toward the back seat. A small whimper filled the car, soft, barely audible, yet filled with an undeniable fear. The sound came from a dog. He was young, barely more than a pup, but already his life had been marked by pain. His golden fur was dirty and matted, his ribs visible beneath the thin skin. His eyes, dark and pleading, darted between the two humans, searching for kindness. But there was none to be found. The man in the passenger seat let out an annoyed grunt. "He is useless. Too weak." The driver sighed. "Then get rid of him." The words were spoken as if the dog were nothing. Not a living, breathing soul. Just a problem to be discarded. The passenger did not hesitate. With a swift motion, he grabbed the dog by the scruff of his neck and yanked him off the seat. The pup yelped, but his cries were drowned out by the roar of the engine. The car door swung open. And then, he was thrown. The impact was immediate and brutal. The small body hit the road with force, rolling and skidding across the pavement. His delicate frame tumbled uncontrollably, each impact scraping his skin, each roll sending jolts of pain through his bones. For a few agonizing moments, the world was nothing but a blur of movement, of flashing lights and unbearable pain. Then, silence. He came to a stop near the edge of the road, his body still. His ribs rose and fell in shallow breaths. Blood trickled from fresh wounds, mixing with the rain-soaked asphalt beneath him. The car never stopped. Its red taillights vanished into the distance, leaving behind nothing but a broken body and the echo of abandonment. For a long moment, the night was still again. And then, a small, pitiful whimper. The dog was alive. Barely. His entire body screamed in pain. His legs refused to move. His vision swam. But deep within him, buried beneath layers of agony and fear, something stirred. Survival. He did not understand why he had been thrown away. He did not understand what he had done wrong. But he knew one thing. He was not done fighting. The road stretched endlessly before him, empty and uncaring. The cold seeped into his bones, making every breath a struggle. His tiny heart pounded erratically, each beat weaker than the last. But he could not stay here. Instinct screamed at him, "Move. Survive." With a trembling effort, he tried to lift his head. His muscles resisted, the pain almost unbearable, but he pushed through. Slowly, he dragged himself forward, his paws scraping against the rough pavement. Every inch felt like a mile. The world around him was vast and indifferent. Cars sped past in the distance, their headlights cutting through the dark, oblivious to the small, suffering creature clinging to life. His breaths came in ragged gasps. His vision blurred, his mind fogged with exhaustion. But he did not stop. Not yet. Somewhere down the road, another car approached. Unlike the last one, this one was not speeding. Its headlights moved steadily, cutting through the darkness with a soft, almost reassuring glow. Inside, Emily sat behind the wheel, her fingers tapping absent-mindedly against the steering wheel. It had been a long day at the animal clinic, and exhaustion clung to her like a heavy blanket. She just wanted to go home, to collapse into bed and let the weight of the day fade away. But fate had other plans. As her car neared the stretch of road ahead, something in her periphery caught her attention. A shadow. Small. Barely moving. Her brows knitted together. What was that? A fallen branch? A discarded piece of clothing? Then, as she drew closer, she saw it. A dog. Her heart clenched. There, on the side of the road, lay a small, injured creature, barely clinging to life. His body was thin, his fur matted with dirt and blood. His breathing was shallow, his eyes barely open. He was dying. Without thinking, Emily pulled over. The tires skidded slightly against the wet pavement, but she barely noticed. In an instant, she was out of the car, her heart pounding. The moment her feet hit the ground, she was running. She reached him in seconds, dropping to her knees beside his frail body. The dog did not react at first. He was too weak to move, too lost in his pain to register what was happening. But as her hands gently brushed against his fur, his eyes flickered open. Dark, glassy, filled with suffering. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God," she whispered. She could see the wounds, the bruises, the cruel reality of what had been done to him. Her stomach twisted in anger and grief. How could someone do this? She reached out, her hands trembling slightly as she touched him again. He flinched. The reaction was small, almost imperceptible, but it broke her heart. He was afraid. Even in his broken state, he expected pain. Tears burned behind her eyes. Hey, it is okay," she murmured softly. "I am not going to hurt you. You are safe now." The dog did not respond, but he did not pull away either. It was enough. With the gentleness of a mother cradling a newborn, Emily carefully scooped him into her arms. He whimpered, his tiny body stiffening from the unfamiliar touch, but she held him close, whispering reassurances. "You are safe," she repeated, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I have got you." For the first time in his life, the little dog was held by hands that did not hurt him. And as Emily carried him toward her car, she made a silent promise. She would not let him go. She would not let him die. Whatever it took, however long it took, she would fight for him, just as he had fought to survive. What happened next was nothing short of a miracle. A journey of resilience, of pain and healing, of trust slowly rebuilt, one small step at a time. A dog who was thrown away, but refused to stop fighting. And if you believe in the power of kindness, stay with me until the end of this story. Because sometimes, the ones who are abandoned are the ones who show us the true meaning of strength. And this dog? He was about to prove just how powerful hope could be. The car's interior smelled of leather and faint lavender, but the little dog hardly noticed. His body was limp against Emily's lap, every breath a struggle. Emily could feel his ribs beneath his thin fur. Every bump in the road made him wince, his fragile body on the edge of breaking. "Stay with me," she whispered, one hand on the wheel, the other resting gently on him. Her heart pounded. She had seen injured dogs before. She worked at an animal clinic, after all, but this? This was something else. This was not just an accident. This was cruelty. And it made her blood boil. Faster. She had to get him to the clinic now. When she finally pulled into the parking lot, she did not waste a second. She scooped him into her arms and ran inside. The lights were harsh and sterile, a stark contrast to the darkness outside. "Dr. Mitchell," she called out. The clinic's head veterinarian turned, eyes widening at the sight of her cradling the frail dog. "He was thrown from a moving car," Emily said breathlessly. I do not know if he is going to make it." Dr. Mitchell did not ask questions. He simply nodded and gestured toward the exam table. Emily laid the dog down carefully, stepping back as the team rushed into action. Oxygen mask. 4 fluids. Gentle hands working against the clock. The dog barely moved. His breathing was slow, labored. His heartbeat faint. Emily clenched her fists. She could not lose him. Not after everything he had been through. Not after he had fought so hard. The next few hours were a blur. Dr. Mitchell examined him thoroughly. "Severe malnourishment," he murmured. "Bruised ribs, road rash, signs of previous abuse." He sighed, shaking his head. "It is a miracle he survived the fall." A miracle. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "Will he make it?" she asked, her voice small. Dr. Mitchell hesitated. "It is hard to say. His body is weak. He needs time." Time. Emily sat beside his kennel that night, watching his small chest rise and fall. Every breath was a battle, every moment a war. She did not leave. She stayed, whispering to him, "You are not alone anymore." The night stretched on, long and silent. And then, a twitch. His paw, barely moving, reached forward ever so slightly. Emily gasped. And in that moment, she knew. He was still fighting. 2 days passed before he finally opened his eyes. Emily was there when it happened, her hand resting gently against the kennel door. Dark, tired eyes blinked up at her. She smiled, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "Hey there," she whispered. For the first time, he saw her. Really saw her. No fear. No pain. Just recognition. She reached a hand toward him, slow and careful. He did not flinch. Instead, he lifted his head, just a little, just enough to rest his chin against her fingers. It was the smallest gesture, but it was everything. Emily let out a shaky breath. "You are a warrior," she whispered. "That is what you are." And just like that, he had a name. Warrior. Warrior's recovery was slow. Some days, he barely moved. His body was weak, and even the simplest tasks, eating, standing, walking, took every ounce of strength he had. But he tried. Every single day, he tried. Emily helped him. She hand-fed him when he was too tired to eat. She carried him outside so he could feel the sun on his face. She whispered to him at night, reminding him over and over, "You are safe now." The first time he wagged his tail, it was barely a flicker. But it was there. And Emily's heart swelled. Step by step, moment by moment, Warrior was learning what it meant to live. But healing was not just physical. Warrior had scars, deep, invisible ones that ran through his heart. The first time someone raised their voice in the clinic, he flinched so hard he nearly toppled over. The first time someone reached for him too quickly, his body tensed, waiting for the hit. The nightmares came, too. In the dead of night, Emily would wake to soft whimpers from his bed. He was dreaming of them, the hands that hurt him, the car that left him behind. It shattered her. And so, she did the only thing she could. She sat beside him, stroked his fur, and whispered, "They are gone. They cannot hurt you anymore." Eventually, his breathing would slow. And in the safety of her presence, he would drift back into sleep. The real turning point came 3 months later. By now, Warrior had grown stronger. His fur was thick and golden again, his once frail frame filling out with proper meals. But there was one thing he had not done yet. Run. Emily had never pushed him. She let him take his time, let him heal at his own pace. But one day, she took him to a quiet field behind the clinic. The grass was soft beneath his paws, the sky wide and endless. Emily knelt beside him, her voice gentle. "You can run, Warrior." He stared up at her, unsure. She reached forward and unhooked his leash. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a breeze ruffled his fur. The scent of the earth filled his nose. And something shifted. His paws twitched. His body tensed. And then, he ran. Emily watched, tears streaming down her face, as Warrior raced through the field. Fast. Free. Alive. His past no longer held him. He was no longer broken. He was whole. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily sat with Warrior outside the clinic. His head rested against her knee, his breathing slow and content. She had been dreading this moment. She knew what came next. Soon, Warrior would be ready for adoption. A forever home. A fresh start. It was what she wanted for him. It was what he deserved. But as she looked down at him, at the dog who had fought so hard, at the soul who had become her heart, her chest tightened. Could she really say goodbye? Could she let him go? Warrior lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. And in them, she saw the answer. She took a deep breath. And smiled. "Warrior," she whispered, stroking his fur. "Would you like to come home?" For a second, he just stared. Then, his tail wagged, slow at first, then faster and faster, until his whole body shook with joy. Emily laughed, tears spilling over. It was not just her decision. It was his. And he had chosen her. Warrior was home. Forever. They say the strongest souls are the ones who refuse to give up. Warrior was thrown away. Left for dead. But he did not stop fighting. And in the end, he won. Because love saved him. And love? It made him unstoppable. Would you have made the same decision? Let me know in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, a quick like helps more people see it. Because sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one person who refuses to look away. The day Warrior came home with Emily, the sky was painted in golden hues, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the quiet neighborhood. The car ride was peaceful, unlike the first time Warrior had been in a vehicle. That night, he had been thrown away like he was nothing. But today, he was being brought home because he was everything. Emily parked in the driveway of her small house, glancing at the dog sitting beside her. Warrior's ears perked up as he gazed out the window, his tail giving a small, hesitant wag. "You are home now," Emily whispered. For a moment, Warrior simply looked at her, as if trying to understand. Then, his tail wagged again. This time, there was no hesitation. Emily unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out, circling to the passenger side. She opened the door and knelt down beside him. "Ready?" she asked softly. Warrior glanced at the ground, at the unfamiliar surroundings, then back at Emily. She extended her hand. A test of trust. For a brief second, he hesitated. The weight of his past still clung to him like a shadow, whispering reminders of hands that had hurt him, voices that had betrayed him. But then, he chose her. Slowly, he stepped forward, placing his paw in her waiting palm. Emily let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "You are so brave," she murmured, stroking his fur. Together, they walked toward the house, the door swinging open to a new beginning. Life with Warrior was not perfect. He was still learning. There were nights when he would wake up trembling, haunted by memories of the road. Emily would be there, sitting beside him in the dark, her voice steady and calm. "You are safe," she would whisper, over and over again, until his breathing evened out. The first time he played with a toy, he did not know what to do. He stared at the small stuffed bear Emily had placed before him, his head tilting in confusion. His world had never held soft things, only hard pavement and cold nights. But when Emily gently nudged the toy toward him, he hesitated, then placed a cautious paw over it. A small step. A huge victory. The first time he let out a bark, Emily nearly cried. It was not loud. It was not confident. But it was his voice. The voice of a dog who had been silent for far too long. And day by day, moment by moment, Warrior found himself again. 6 months later, on a bright spring morning, Emily took Warrior back to the same field where he had first run free. This time, there was no uncertainty in his steps. As soon as the leash was unhooked, he took off, his golden fur shining in the sunlight, his strong legs carrying him faster than ever before. Emily watched in awe, her heart swelling. This was him now. Not the scared, broken dog she had found on the side of the road. Not the fragile, trembling soul who flinched at every sound. No. This was Warrior. A survivor. A fighter. A dog who had reclaimed his life. One afternoon, months after Warrior had settled into his new life, Emily was walking him through town when something unexpected happened. A car drove past. A familiar make. A familiar model. It slowed slightly at the stoplight, and Warrior froze. Emily felt the sudden tension in the leash, looking down to see his body rigid, his tail tucked. His eyes were locked onto the car. For a moment, she thought, could it be them? The people who had thrown him away? Her breath caught. The driver turned his head slightly. And then, the light changed. The car moved on, disappearing into the distance. Emily knelt beside Warrior, placing a gentle hand on his back. "They do not matter anymore," she whispered. Warrior exhaled sharply, his body slowly relaxing. Then, he looked up at her, and wagged his tail. Not out of fear. Not out of submission. But out of freedom. Because he understood. The past no longer had power over him. He had won. Warrior's story could have ended that night on the road. He could have been another forgotten soul, another victim of cruelty. But he was not. Because someone stopped. Because someone cared. Because someone refused to look away. And that made all the difference. For every warrior in the world, there is someone who can change their fate. Sometimes, it only takes one person. One act of kindness. One decision to fight for them when no one else will. Warrior was thrown away. But he refused to stop fighting. And in the end, he did not just survive. He thrived. He found a home. He found love. And most importantly, he found himself again. Not all heroes wear capes. Some have 4 legs, a wagging tail, and a heart that refuses to give up. If you have ever witnessed or experienced something like this, share your story below. Your words can inspire someone today. And if this story touched your heart, a quick like helps more people see it. Because sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one moment of kindness. This is just one of many stories of resilience, love, and second chances. Subscribe to be part of a community that believes in hope. Because together, we can change the world, one act of kindness at a time.